All right, let's tease out rather more explicitly the philosophical contrast between these two stories, particularly the metaphysical contrast, and also, since human beings do figure in significantly in both of the stories, the contrasting views of human nature, and there also are some value implications that are built into these stories as well. So I want to contrast the two stories in terms of different ethics and value type approaches. So I'm going to put a rectangular box in the middle here, and I'll just start to itemize a number of differing things, contradictory things that these two stories are saying on any number of significant philosophical points. All right, one certainly is right at the very beginning. If we go back to the beginning of this story, what is the basic stuff of the universe, or the most important ingredient in the universe? This one is clearly saying it is physical stuff. The physical stuff can come in the material form or in the form of energy, and those two are convertible under certain circumstances. But essentially what we have is a claim on this side that the physical has priority. What we might call psychological stuff or soul stuff or spiritual stuff doesn't come until much later in the story with the development of psychological beings. But in the beginning, and what has priority then is physical stuff. That's clearly directly contradicted by the claim on this side of the story that in the beginning, the fundamental stuff or the stuff that has priority is non-physical spiritual stuff. So we can say there's a conflict here. Is it the case that it's physical stuff or spiritual stuff that has priority? Metaphysical issue number one. All right, if we focus then on beings that are both physical and spiritual, whatever we mean by those labels here, at this point, human beings as the most clearly psychological beings that exist, they come into the story much later. Here, they come into the story much earlier. But here, human beings come out of the physical universe. And so the psychological is an outgrowth or an emergent set of properties that come and depend upon earlier physical developments here. So here what we have is the idea, I'll put it this way, that the psychological is dependent on a certain underlying physical constitution or a physical structure. Here, the story is quite different. If we take the breath or the spiritual side of human nature, it does not seem to depend for its existence on the underlying physical or the physical elements that it happens to be conjoined with. If man is a microcosm of God, if man is made partially in God's image, the spiritual part of him can in principle exist independently of the physical, just as God's spirit can exist independently of any sort of necessary physical connection. So do we say that the psychological is dependent, as this story seems to be saying, or is the psychological, if we use that as a neutral term at this point, independent of the physical? Actually, let me add a little bit more here. A third point of contrast that seems to follow directly on number two here is the ultimate fate of what we call the psychological. On this story here, if we start down here this time, man's spirit came from God and does not depend upon the physical. So in principle, when the physical starts to break down, as it does when we age and ultimately our physical bodies die, that does not necessarily spell the end for the spiritual side of our identity. If it's not dependent upon the physical, then it can continue in existence, having the integrity of its existence maintained and carry on to have a further destiny here. So is it the case then that what we call the soul is in principle something that is immortal, Or is it, as this story tells, which seems to be a very different story, if it's the case that what we call the psychological or the soul or the spiritual side of human nature is dependent upon an underlying complicated physical structure, if that underlying physical structure deteriorates, breaks down, and is no longer functioning, then the implication is that the soul or the spirit will then go out of existence. And that then is to say, our souls will be mortal. Right? We'll be mortal beings, beings that exist in the world for a certain amount of time, as opposed to a potentially unlimited amount of time as on this account here. Another implication that follows immediately, what then is our ultimate destiny, right, as human beings? In terms of our value orientation, what should we be taking to be the most important thing in life? Clearly, on the more naturalistic conception, if we have a finite amount of time on Earth, that we are naturalistic beings, part of the natural world, then whatever we take to be goodness or value or the meanings of our lives, it's going to have to be found in the natural world, so in the here and now, right, so to speak. So we will then say that ultimately the meaning of life on this conception is to be found in nature. And the implication from this story's perspective seems to be quite different. If man came from God and came into existence for whatever reasons God has, then the meaning of our existence is not to be found in the natural world per se, but it's to be found in God's plan, in God's conception, or whatever God's purpose is. And if it's the case that our body is a temporary vehicle to which our spirit is attached, and our spirit really is the thing that is going to survive for many, many years beyond our bodily life, then the meaning of our life is going to be found not so much in our temporary stay here in the natural world, but in the world beyond. So is the meaning of life to be found in nature or in the supernatural world, in God's plan or in our life after we leave the natural world?